I'll just open it up. So, okay.
Okay.
So, good afternoon, everyone. This is State Senator Jamie Eldridge, and so glad after a couple months break to bring back my Uplifting Voices podcast. Took a little bit of a break with the legislative session ending, but glad to be back. And I'm just so honored to have a guest that I just have so much respect for her advocacy, as well as really educating me about an area of immigration law and a group of young people that I wasn't as familiar with. And so we have as my guest Vrinda Punj, who is the state liaison for Improve the Dream, a grassroots youth-led advocacy group fighting for a group of young people known as documented dreamers, which is a new term again that I have learned. So, so Vrinda, thank you so much for being on, and great to see you. I know we had the chance to meet a couple times earlier this summer, but how are you doing?
I'm doing well, and I just wanted to give you a big thank you for bringing me on your podcast because this is an area that you said that you weren't very familiar with it, but neither was I. I didn't even know that there were so many other kids like me in the situation. So if someone if someone in this situation isn't even aware that there are others like them, I think this shows how much education is needed. So thank you for being willing to just sort of talk about this.
Absolutely, and I want to talk more about your experiences and your family's arrival to the U.S. and Massachusetts. But is it accurate to say that a lot of young documented dreamers, especially when they're kids, have no idea about this unique immigration status, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people grow up like normal American teenagers. We have very normal American lives. We think of ourselves as Americans. I'm sure a lot of us, have parents that are, immigrants. So we definitely have that sort of background of a different heritage, maybe, or a different culture that we're balancing. But we go to American high schools, American, we play on American teams, our colleagues, our schoolmates, they're all Americans. So we just think of ourselves as Americans.
Absolutely, and I think that's the thing. I just want to be so clear about is in every possible way you are American. Your parents are, in terms of how you're giving back and your lives here and your experiences. And I think on the immigration status front, I think there's just too many Americans in general that just think that immigration status is black and white. It's U.S. citizen, legal permanent resident, undocumented or without legal status. But there's actually so many categories, even within a family. Parents, and kids, and other relatives having different immigration status. And I think there's a real need to recognize that and to better educate Americans in general about that.
I think that you kind of hit it on the head about this, because I think one of the biggest problems is that it is very black and white, and that there are grayer areas, like people here on long-term visas. That's something that people might not know a lot about. And this issue of documented dreamers really comes from the issue of long-term visa holders who have been staying in the country for decades, but have no clear pathway to citizenship, or their kids don't, at least. And we can kind of get into that.
Absolutely, and as often on the immigration status front, a lot of times there'll be those that perhaps tend to be a little more conservative that say, well, you need to get in line or get back in the line. But the point is, there often is no line for a lot of different immigration statuses and families. And I know that's really what you and your family have found yourselves up against over the past few years.
Thank you for bringing up the line, because that is something that I think you know, it's very easy to sort of portray immigration in terms of a line, right? Because I think it's very easy to kind of sort of sell that in terms of media and other things like that. It's just very easy to say, well, there's a line, you can kind of wait your turn, and then once you get into the front of the line, then you've done everything right and you've gotten, you know, you've gotten permanent residency. That's the way to do it. But what we found is that, yeah, with regards to the current immigration laws, even if you try to follow the law, oftentimes the line is so inaccessible. In the case of, you know, my situation, there really is no line for me to get into. And, you know, that's sort of where the problem kind of comes in, is that, you know, there is a, you know, waiting your turn, but then, you know, if you don't have access to even wait, that really becomes a big problem, is that you need to be able to at least be able to wait. And that's kind of what we're asking for.
Absolutely. And to add a little personal detail, so you you and your family live in North Chelmsford, and you're a software engineer, right?
Yes.
And what college did you go to?
I graduated from the University of Massachusetts Lowell back in 2021.
That's great. And so, you know, giving back in every possible way. And yeah, the term, again, documented dreamers. If you could talk a little bit about your family and, you know, how your parents came here from India, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, let's start from the very beginning. So my dad, you know, is from New Delhi, India, and he met my mom there, and that's where they got married. And I was born there as well. And my dad was working as a business analyst, and he got an offer to come and work in the United States in 2004. And so he thought it was a short project, and that it wasn't going to be for long. So actually, me and my mom were living in India, and my dad actually moved to the United States back in 2004. And that one small project that was supposed to take 6 months ended up not, and he ended up just staying. And then in 2005, he was like, it seems like this is like a permanent type of a job. So I'm just gonna, you guys should probably come and live here. So when I was 6 years old, I moved to the US. And I really had a wonderful time living here. My parents also really liked living in America. They thought that it was a wonderful place. They loved the education system here in Massachusetts. They thought that I had a really nice community of friends and people around them as well that were lovely people, nice neighbors. It was just like a wonderful experience for us.
Yeah.
So,
and Vrinda, if I could ask, do you have memories of India, or your you know, 5-6 years growing up in India?
I have small memories of India, you know. I remember my grandparents, but it's nothing substantial, because it was, you know, up until the age of 6, it's like, you know, there's not a lot that's going on in life. You haven't really started school very much. Like I started kindergarten in the US, right? So like there wasn't a lot of stuff. Like I do remember my grandparents a little bit, but life there, not really. And especially like navigating life there is a totally different thing. Like as a kid, you know, you're really carefree, but like navigating life there, I have nothing, you know, because your parents take care of you when you're younger.
Exactly. And, you know, the district I represent, as you know, a very large Indian American and South Asian American community. And, you know, I know, talking to Indian American constituents, that even those that came, you know, in their 20s or 30s, you know, after school, you know, they say when they go to India, you know, they're seen by Indians, by their relatives in India, is Americanized, you know, is different from growing up in India. So even those that lived, you know, up through their 20s in India or other countries, are seen as Americanized when they go back.
India is a beautiful country, but it's very different than the United States, culturally
Mhm.
different, and also very diverse as well. So it's just so different there that it's like if I were to say like, okay, if I were to go back and be able to like immediately relate to people there, I don't think it would be that easy for sure.
Mhm. Absolutely. And in terms of when your father came here, so it was through a special visa, it's the H-1B, is that correct?
Yes, that's yes.
So what is that? What is, I hear a lot about the H-1B, visa, both from constituents that, are here on that visa, but also from just companies talking about, trying to attract more or need more foreign workers. So what is the H-1B visa?
So the H-1B visa, it's a visa that is created for essentially high skilled workers. It was specifically designed for, specialty occupations where there are not a lot of people, or there's a labor shortage, or certain industries have a very, have high labor demands, or have very niche
Mhm.
specialties. And so the H-1B visa is essentially designed as a way for, if we can't find the talent domestically, then maybe we can, bring them over from overseas, people who might be able to fill that role.
Absolutely. And so it's something that an American company has to request the visa and is the sort of host for the employee.
Yes, it is not self-sponsored. You have to be sponsored by an employer who needs your labor in order to qualify for it.
Mhm.
And they also, there are some labor requirements with that visa. So you have to be, they have to prove that there are, um, you know, that they really, cannot find someone, and that this is,
Mhm.
this is something that only the person from overseas can kind of qualify for.
Absolutely. And so obviously, as you said, your father arrived first, and you came here when with your mom, and as you said, you loved growing up in America and felt in every sense American and grew up in Massachusetts and enjoy Massachusetts.
I, Massachusetts is one of the best places in the world. I mean, I could just say that much. It's really, I think, so diverse. It's wonderful, but I think what's even more better than the diversity is the acceptance of that diversity, and I've seen that from Massachusetts. It's that despite me being, not necessarily, I was, not necessarily fully American. I mean, I'm still not an American on paper yet, but it was that acceptance of other people's heritage, other people's heritage, other people's cultures. And I think Massachusetts is very unique in that it's very diverse, and people are very accepting of diversity of all sorts.
Absolutely. And although it's a different group of immigrants that have a different legal challenge, I will just say in the past week with the arrival of approximately 50 Venezuelan immigrants from apparently Florida and or Texas to Martha's Vineyard. It's just been wonderful to see Martha's Vineyard, residents immediately support, those immigrants. And now, you have Massachusetts state resources, including a Cape Cod Air Base, welcoming and supporting those immigrants. And it really has been a very positive, beautiful show of support and compassion by, I really think Massachusetts values.
I couldn't agree more. And it was a triumph of American values itself, showing
Exactly.
showing the compassion and the kindness of American people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so just curious, you're now the statewide liaison for Improve the Dream. So how did you come to that? And I think really, how did you become aware of the immigration status challenge you have, in addition to actually what is that challenge? What is the challenge you have in your life to stay here in Massachusetts, to stay in the US?
So, as you mentioned, my parents came on an H-1B visa which is something that's known as a dual intention visa. And these are like, some complex immigration terms. So feel free to interrupt me at any time if you want to ask questions, because I'm sure even for the viewers, this stuff can be hard, but it's interesting. So what it means is that it's a temporary visa. It's meant to be, you can make it for 3 years, or you can extend it up to 6 years. However, if your company decides that, we want you to around for a long time, they are legally allowed to file for a permanent residency application on your behalf. And if they do that, you can keep staying here beyond the 6 years. So in a way, it's like a temporary visa, but not really, because if you file for a green card application, you can keep staying as long as that green card application is pending. Now, what happens is that you're getting a green card based off of your employment. And the problem is that there is a 7% country cap on visa, on the employment-based immigration system. So that means that for that 7% country cap essentially makes it so that for big countries like India and China, there's a big backlog, and people wait sometimes decades for a green card. Whereas from a smaller country, like let's just say Switzerland or Sweden, that's not such a big case, because that 7% country cap does not take into consideration the population size. And so bigger countries really struggle with that. And it's based off of where you're born. It's an immutable trait. You cannot fix it. So it's very arbitrary. It's based off of place of birth. So if you're born in India or China, you face a backlog. And if you're not born in those countries, you can get a green card right away.
Sure. And so that your parents then were renewing this visa then over your years of growing up?
Yes. So actually what happened with my family was that my parents were actually not able to apply for a green card when they first came here. So they in 2010, my dad was working for Deloitte, which is a top consulting company. But the financial crisis kind of hit, and in 2008, and they stopped kind of sponsoring green cards. So my dad was on an H-1B, a temporary visa, and he wasn't able to get that green card application in time. So actually I had to self-deport from the country at the age of 10 years old when I was in the 6th grade.
What does that actually mean, self-deport, or what actually happens?
Well, self-deport typically means like when your visa runs out, or you no longer have a legal means to stay in the United States. Many people will self-deport because you can't work many jobs without having a proper status, without proper work authorization. You are not allowed to really do anything. So they literally leave the country. So they just leave so that they can keep being like, they can comply, like they're supposed to leave. So they deport themselves, even though they don't want to. Their visa runs out and they leave. Like that's kind of what self-deport means. Sure.
And so what happened at age 10 then?
So yeah, my family packed up their bags, and my dad was working in Deloitte, so they basically moved him to the United Kingdom. And it was heartbreaking for me, I think, especially at a young age, especially because I really wanted to be an American, and then being told at a very young and like kind of a fragile age that, hey, actually, you're not an American, you have no rights here. And by the way, we have to get kicked out. Because we don't have any status here. That was really hard for me to hear as a kid who really, loved this country and thought of myself as an American.
Yeah, and to leave your school, to leave your friends, everything you knew, growing up initially in the U.S.
Yeah, and it was under circumstances that I know my family didn't want. my mom really liked it here. I know my dad had a good time here as well. So it was actually a very sad move. It was, some people, they move, they leave the country and they're looking for an adventure. And
Mhm.
I think that that's something that's completely different. This was very traumatizing for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important point because, whether you're talking about, sort of virtually all forms of emigration, of, leaving your native country or the country that, you feel is your adopted country, it's very traumatizing. It creates a lot of pain to leave for sort of arbitrary or government reasons, or, sometimes economic desperation or other things. And you experience that as well in your family going to Great Britain.
Yeah, and the thing is like I said, Great Britain, another beautiful country, but it wasn't home. That's all I
Mhm.
can say about it. It was just not, you know, there was a lot of a big culture difference with between Massachusetts and Great Britain. There was a lot of, you know, logistical problems of, of
Mhm.
me being able to find a school, of me being able to, just because, here in America, there's a policy that, if you buy a house in a neighborhood or if you live in a neighborhood, you can kind of go to that local school. There's no such thing like that.
Mm.
So I'm moving there in the middle of the school year, and like my parents are scrambling to find a place for me, and they end up finding like a school that's a 2-hour commute away from my
Mm.
house, because
Mhm.
that was the options that were kind of available. So it was just, it's very hard to like all of a sudden just pack up and like leave. Um,
Absolutely. And where you moved to in England, I mean, were there many other uh, Indian families, or just curious?
Honestly, like I will say that I think that there's a very large South Asian population in Great Britain, but
Mhm.
frankly, like I think we'd kind of established such a great base here that I didn't really have like a lot of like we didn't have a lot of family friends. I didn't have a lot of personal friends living in the UK. It was very isolating. It was a very lonely
Mhm.
experience for me.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to hear that. And yeah, how many years was the family in the UK?
My family was in the UK for about a year and a half. My dad found another project in the United States, so then
Mhm.
he got transferred back in, and that's
Mm.
why we were able to. I was so happy the day that my dad was like, actually, we have to move back to the US now. So I was like, yay, I can finally be an American. But I later realized that that was just going to be the very beginning. Even that like happiness was the very beginning of a very long and still ongoing, um, painful immigration journey.
Absolutely. And so yeah, what was that sort of next phase of your awareness of the situation you're in, and what the family did next as you got older?
Yeah, so I think I think I mentioned I moved around 11 years old, not 10 years old. I'll correct that. I think I was
Mhm.
11 and I came back at 13. And at 13, I realized all of the legality
Mm. Mhm.
of my situation. I understood every bit of it. I understood that I am not a US citizen. I understood that I'm not a green card holder. I understand that I have no protections. That I am here legally, but that what I'd already gone through the course process of figuring out what happens when things go wrong. So I'd already known all of that at a very young age, at the age in 8th grade, and so that I think that became sort of a big problem for me in my life, where I realized that I am different, and
Mhm.
I felt as though I did not belong, because of the laws, and I didn't really know like what I had done to like deserve feeling this way, because I felt like I was an American, but at the same time there was, at
Mhm.
every kind of major juncture of my life, I was facing obstacle after obstacle. And I can kind of go through some of those examples for you.
Please do, yeah, because I think there again, I think often there's a sense from some Americans that you know uh, immigrants who come to the U.S., that the streets are paved with gold, and everything is is great, and there's no, challenges or barriers when that's, exactly the opposite, no matter, what status you are. So.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things I think that, really made me feel upset was my inability to work. So that's something that I think it's like a rite of passage for a lot of American teenagers and stuff is the ability to work. I actually think that's a wonderful thing. It's not in every culture that's the thing, teenagers working, but I think that's something that is uniquely American and very special. And at the age of 16 years old, everyone else that I know was getting their jobs. They were able to, save up money for a little bit of money for helping out with college. They were able to, maybe buy a car for themselves if they worked hard, and stuff like that. And they were able to also, get coffee sometimes. But I had no money whatsoever because legally I was not allowed to work as a dependent. So you mentioned the H-1B, right? So I did not come on an H-1B. My dad was the only one that in my family who was allowed to work. My mother was not allowed to work. And you can imagine that having that extra income, a dual income, can really change the fate of many families. But not being able, her just being like not be allowed to being able to work was not really great. And then for me as well, like I really wanted to be able to work. We did not have the right to work, and that was really heartbreaking. When I went to go get a driver's license, they asked me for papers which we didn't have, and that kind of caused a bunch of confusion. And then they realized we were here legally. So I had to go to the Social Security office and get like a letter, like an exception letter. And only then was I able to apply for a driver's license in the United States. And that was another thing where I was like, everybody else gets to go and get a driver's license, but I have to, like, with my situation, it was, they people at the RMV were already very like, razzled up, and they were already confused about like, they didn't, again, like, I think a lot of people are like green card holders, or permanent residents, US citizens, and like undocumented. And then like, nobody kind of knows that there's like this type of a situation in between. So we had to go get that exception letter. And then that's when I was able to drive, but still it felt like,
and I'll say I know that you're a true Massachusetts native or local, because you have the same experience that we all share, is what a terrible agency the RMV is, and how backed up and complicated it is just to do basic renewals of licenses and things. So you are a true Massachusetts resident.
True. And then on top of that, there's that other, bureaucracy of dealing with the Social Security office as well, getting that letter of exception, because I think they ask you for a Social Security number, and we didn't have that because you're not allowed to work, right? So and then afterwards, like, I think the biggest punch was college. That was a really big problem because you're considered an international student, and that puts the kind of pressure that puts financially on families is crippling.
What is that? If you could explain that a little more, because sometimes people don't realize that you can grow up essentially in Massachusetts, but you're still classified as an international student.
Yes, and actually, Massachusetts, I would say, is one of the is actually a great state to live in if you're kind of in an H-1B situation, or if you're stuck in that backlog. But there are other states that are even, much harder, because what happened is Massachusetts State universities, at first we had no idea. I had no idea what I would be classified as. So when I applied, they put me into an international student category. After many phone calls, after many meetings, I was able to convince them that actually I'm a Massachusetts resident and here are my records. And then I think that they were able to say, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but okay, like, we can give you in-state tuition because you've kind of classified that you're a Massachusetts resident for many years, and all that. But I was initially put into that category of international student. I will tell
Sure.
you that like some of my friends and other people, doesn't matter. They just straight up pay out of pocket. And that is,
Right. It's so complicated to prove that. And what is that margin of difference? I mean, you're talking what, tens of thousands of dollars every year difference in tuition?
it is absolutely it is tens of thousands of dollars. Yes.
Mhm.
Huge margin of difference. Like, yes, like maybe $25,000 difference.
Absolutely. And just to highlight, because this is, talking about these experiences, is that, a colleague of mine now, Representative Danilo Senna, immigrant from Brazil, who was a different type of dreamer growing up in Massachusetts, but because of his status, yeah, when he went through Middlesex Community College and UMass Amherst, he was, classified as an international student and had to pay the non-state tuition rate, and that set it up that he had to spend many more years going to college than someone that was classified as getting in-state tuition.
Yes, and that's a privilege that I can't thank the Massachusetts government enough for, or at least the colleges, for at least classifying me because of my visa, that I had that, so thankfully. But most states, you're not allowed in-state tuition if you're a documented dreamer. And unfortunately, it seems as though undocumented dreamers in Massachusetts also have to pay out of pocket, which is very unfortunate. I can't.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that thing. But then the problem also comes down to the fact that you're 100% reliant on your parents, and in my case, again, like a single income earner, to pay for your education, because you're not allowed to have any scholarships, any federal scholarships, any private scholarships, any loans, any federal loans, and not even a private loan.
My goodness, not even a private loan.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's not even, because the first thing that a loan company will ask you is for a social security number.
Sure,
and,
sure.
Like, if you don't have that, then how are you going to take out a loan? So it's in every single way, subsidizing the education, figuring out how to pay for it, you're really left at the mercy of what your parents can afford, and regardless of your academic achievements or whatever you've done in college, and in high school, there's if your parents can't afford it, there is nothing you can do to go to the college that you want to go to.
Absolutely. And even though I wasn't going to put in a plug today for any of my bills, I do want to note that I continue to be the Senate sponsor of debt-free college, to make college free, both tuition fees, books, housing, and it's something I'll be filing again. But you make a great point, is that if there's a single parent, household, or single, or just one parent earning, having an income, having a job, what a barrier that is to going to college. Even our public universities, which are somewhat less expensive than private, but it's still a major barrier in America, throughout America. So.
And I consider myself lucky, like very lucky, because I had very supportive parents that were willing to do what it took to get me educated. So so we moved from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, closer to UMass Lowell, so I could commute. And my dad was anyways working close to the university, so he thought it would be a move that would be able to, because he couldn't afford, to send me to UMass Lowell, like, as having me dorm there and all that, as, again, like a single earner. So we had to, I commuted in every single day to save money. And I'm forever thankful to my parents for that. And again, that comes from privilege, right? Like being able to, move and stuff like that. It was a move that benefited my family, but I can see, if my dad was working closer to where my old house was, how inaccessible it would be for me to go to college. It was just lucky. It was just luck that he was working already close to the university. So he was like, all right, we can move here. Something like that. But it,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And
And
so you went to UMass Lowell and you graduated, and then what were you facing given your status? What happened?
well, so this was during UMass Lowell,
Okay.
where the
Mhm.
big kind of right now a lot of the things I've sort of mentioned is like the really things that make you feel like an outsider, not being able to work, not being able to get scholarships. But then when I realized that the biggest thing is the deportation that you might be facing from the country, because
Mhm.
what happens when you're on a dependent visa, and you're a beneficiary of your parents' green card application. So at this point, my parents had applied for a green card and they were waiting in line. And they applied when I was around in starting college. So I was like around 17, 18. So for 4 years, they were waiting. And then, you know, when I turned 21, I got kicked out of their green card application
Mm.
and I lost my dependent visa, meaning I lost my H4 visa that was allowing me to stay in the country as a dependent. And I hated that visa because I
Mm.
couldn't work on it and do so much, but at least I was allowed to live in the US. But now I was faced under, I had to figure out another way to stay.
And that was just automatic. So as soon as you turned 21, you were
You're
kicked
out.
out of that program. Hmm.
Yes. As soon as you turn 21, you get kicked out. And what happened with me was I had to switch over to what's known as an international students visa because I was in college at the time. You have the ability to potentially switch over to an F1. It's called an F1 visa. But the thing about the F1 visa is that it's a temporary student visa. So it doesn't guarantee you like a long-term stay in the United States. It's again a temporary visa that you're supposed to leave as soon as you finish your education. And number two, the biggest problem with that is it's a single intention visa. And so,
Hmm.
as I mentioned earlier, the H-1B is a dual intention visa. So you're allowed to apply for a green card with it. But with a single intention visa, they're much more, I like to call them a little scarier because with those, you have to prove non-immigrant intent when you're applying for
Mm.
those. And the way you prove non-immigrant intent is proving what is known as ties to your home country. And for
Mm.
someone like me who has had no ties to the United States,
Hmm.
um, I left India when I was 6 years old and have lived outside of India for 21. So for 50, they know for 15 years, I have not lived in my home country.
Hmm.
So when I applied for it, it was like I was losing nights of sleep. I couldn't sleep every day because if that change of status got rejected, I would be thrown out because that was my
Hmm.
only way to stay. That was
And
my only way to stay. And so it's a coin flip. It's based off of officer discretion, whether or not you
yeah,
get.
absolutely. And I would just say on the officer discretion, I just as someone that does a lot of advocacy for constituents who are immigrants is yeah, often it depends on that one interview and whether the Homeland Security or INS officer is friendly or disposed to a person's story. It really can be that arbitrary and random. So
It really is that arbitrary. So if like because they have every reason to deny me, right? Because I do not have ties to my home country. I do not
mhm.
have like property in India or like living like close family in India. My sister's a US citizen and my parents are waiting in line for their green card. They know all of this. So, you know, they know this. So if I say, I'm here, I have non-immigrant intent, they can say like, well, I don't believe you. And
Right, exactly. And I just wanted, as someone who's taking some notes, is that just your family's experience. We've got the H-1B visa. You mentioned H-4 and F-1, and my guess is most people watching this podcast or just in general were not aware of at least two of those three visas, including myself. I personally have not heard of the H-4 F-1. So that's there's so many different types of visas, and it's not just U.S. citizen, green card, or undocumented. There's all types of gray areas in between.
Yeah, yeah. And just to be clear, the H-4 visa, it's a visa that's meant for dependents of H-1Bs, so spouses and children. Just to kind of explain that.
Sure.
Yeah, so that was the thing. And I've seen people, and I know personally people who have gotten their F1 denied and they had to leave and stuff like that. So when you turn 21, if you don't go to college, you'd have to leave, because then there's nothing that you can do about that. And if you do go to college, it's still a coin flip whether or not you get it, because that visa F1. And by the way, to this day, I don't travel. I cannot travel outside the US because they're going to, I'm going to have to get a visa stamped in my passport. And again, that requires an interview. Again, that's based off of officer discretion. So if I leave, there's a chance I might not be able to come back home. And so that's why.
Absolutely frightening. Absolutely frightening. Yep.
Yeah.
And just restricting. Yeah.
It's restrictive. I mean, I missed my grandmother's funeral. I've missed weddings, a lot of things, a lot of family events back home in India. I've not been able to go because it's too much of a risk for me to travel. And all of this is done, trying to stay compliant and doing things by the book as well, right? We're trying to follow the procedure, and yet, that this types of restrictions are there.
Absolutely. And so now, you're working as a software engineer. What are the immigration challenges you face, and obviously what is your advocacy? What kind of advocacy are you doing?
So the challenges that I'm currently facing is that I am allowed to work for up to 3 years after I graduate from college, because I have a STEM major, and my challenges right now are being able to get an H-1B visa, the same visa my father came on back in 2004, and it's the same visa that my company is trying to apply for. That visa is based off of a lottery. So it's a pure lottery, and that's the problem, is my chances of staying in the country have come down to like an arbitrary lottery. And that's why I found when I found Improve the Dream, I realized that this is a really great organization that is fighting for these kind of, I like this group of forgotten children, and trying to give them some kind of mechanism to be able to stay.
Absolutely. And in Massachusetts being, a high-tech, well-educated workforce, how many documented dreamers are there approximately in Massachusetts?
So I can't give you the actual data on that because we don't really have like state by state data, but I can imagine there's absolutely massive amounts in Massachusetts because it's a place where a lot of immigrants come to. There's a lot of, high skilled workforce that comes here internationally. And so there's a lot of people in Massachusetts, and there's 200,000 children like me across 250,000 children across the country like me as well. And so we're doing advocacy to make it so that we can end this process known as aging out of the immigration system at 21.
Absolutely. And so I know from our meeting and our conversations, you've taken the trip down to Washington, D.C. to do advocacy, and what was that like, and what's the status right now of trying to fix this loophole?
So that's a great question, and we can talk about that. So the status with that is that we really would have ideally wanted, a mechanism for permanent residency. And that is why, we were able to get America's Children Act introduced in the House and the Senate. It's a bicameral legislation, and it's also a bipartisan legislation that essentially allows children who have maintained lawful long-term status, they've stayed in like the country for 10 years and they've maintained legal status. It allows them, it gives them a pathway to permanent residency. That's kind of the big thing about America's Children Act, that it does provide a pathway to permanent residency. But, you know, we wanted to, kind of, adding more green cards or increasing the number of green cards is something that I think is a little controversial
Mhm.
right now due to a various number of reasons.
Mhm.
So what we have done instead is essentially, in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, we have taken key aspects of America's Children Act, but have removed the mechanism that would essentially allow us to get that permanent residency, and instead
Mm.
sort of make it so that we can continue living in the United States with our parents' visas, that H-4 visa,
Mhm.
and also get the ability to work. So it would
Mhm.
essentially kind of give us like almost like a DACA like status, which is like not necessarily like, a pathway to permanent residency, but
Mhm.
something similar, which is that we have the ability to work and we're able to, as long as our parents are in line for a green card, we are also able to stay.
Sure. And let me just say, as an elected official, someone who's been a legislator for 20 years, I appreciate sort of the political strategy and nuance from the heart, and I'm sure you feel the same way. It just reinforces to me what a broken immigration system we have, and that the realities in DC, and not that it's perfect in Massachusetts, but just the realities in DC is that you and your organization and fellow documented dreamers have had to make those concessions because the full fix apparently is not at the not in the light at the end of the tunnel yet, which is very frustrating. So
Yes, and the full fix, I think where there is bipartisanship, where there is something that both sides of the aisle, especially in today's political climate where it's 50-50, right? And the Senate needs that, you need that magical 60 number to be able to move stuff along. It's very, where we can get bipartisanship on pieces of legislation, especially as controversial and polarizing as immigration right now. It's very important that incremental progress is made. I always like to say, if I could stop one person from deportation, I would. That's life changing.
absolutely, absolutely. And so that fix in the NDAA, has it passed the House? Has it passed the Senate? What's the status?
So it has passed with great bipartisanship in the House. It was put into an en bloc in the House of Representatives, and it passed with an en bloc is like a bunch of amendments, and it passed
Mm-hmm.
there. And now our goal is to really try to get this into the Senate version of the NDAA, because
Mm-hmm.
that way it would be in both the House and the Senate. And so when it goes into the conference, there's nothing to reconcile there. It's passed in both the House and the Senate, and we'd be able to get it signed into law by President Biden at the end of the year.
Absolutely. And if that becomes law, what does that mean for you personally? How does that make you feel if your organization can accomplish that by the end of the session?
So right now, my situation is that I need to get an H-1B visa, right? And I have 2 more years because this year my company applied for an H-1B visa for me. And it's a lottery, so I did not get selected. And if I do not get selected in the next 2 years, I will be deporting myself outside of the United States. I will be leaving. I don't know where I'd be leaving to, but I will be leaving. And it would be heartbreaking, but I would have to go because, like I said, I can't work. As an engineer, I would not be able to work and be able to contribute fully. And I would also become undocumented if I were to overstay my visa. So I would have to leave. And if this amendment gets passed, It would
Mhm.
essentially allow me the ability to stay with my family, because my family's still here waiting for a green card, and I would be allowed to go back on my dad's old visa that I aged out of. I was no longer allowed to use, and keep working here until I'm able to find a way to stay. Maybe maybe my company can apply for a green card for myself. um Oh, our amendment also freezes the child's age so that they
Mm.
don't get kicked out of their parents' green card application. So maybe once my parents get their green card, I will be able to get it with them, stuff like that.
Absolutely. And you really know the nuances, and you've been just incredibly, even-handed and just, calm in discussing these things. But I mean, I have to imagine you have some anxiety not knowing, what your place is in America right now, right?
Yeah, there is a great amount of anxiety, and it's been going on for the past 10 years since I, really figured
Hmm.
out, hey, I have no status. But, I also have to say that we earlier talked about, the triumph of, of the situation in Martha's Vineyard, where people from Massachusetts really gave it their all. And I think that this kind of value
Hmm.
system is part of the American, it's in the American fabric. It's embedded in
Hmm.
the flag. It's in our roots. So I think that I'm very optimistic that this can get done. And I'm very optimistic
Hmm.
that one of the things I'm hoping for is that potentially, if we can get something like this, a narrower fix like this into law, I think that this would be a really good step in the right
Hmm.
direction for more smaller bipartisan pieces of legislation that can sort of move through. Because right now we're kind of been in, immigration reform has been stuck for a long time. I've been waiting for it myself for 10 years. And so
Hmm.
getting small bipartisan pieces of legislation through, um, and if a comprehensive overhaul would be great. But,
Absolutely.
you know, taking wins where we can get them would be
Hmm.
something I would love to see. Would love to see it for all immigrants of different types.
Absolutely. And so you formed Improve the Dream. You're a leading documented dreamer, and obviously you and your fellow documented dreamers are just doing tremendous advocacy. Those of us that are U.S. citizens, or have a firmer status in Massachusetts or the U.S., what can we do to help? Is there communication that we should be doing with our congresspersons or our senators?
Yes. So I would urge everybody listening on this podcast to go to improvethedream.org. There we have, we have an automated letter that you can send out to your member of Congress. You can, fill out our letter, share it with your friends, family members, as and that will automatically send a letter to Elizabeth Warren, and Congressman Markey as well,
Mhm.
no, Senator Markey, and it's like that. And we also have call templates that you can use as well, so we could have people calling in. Really, the goal is to get as much support in all 50 states as possible. If you know people from other states, share it with them.
Mhm.
All that kind of
Ab-
stuff.
Absolutely. The thing I always say to constituents of mine who say, well, Jamie, we already know you support this, so should we send you an email? And I said, well, yes, send me an email, but also for your family members, for your friends in other districts where perhaps they're not as progressive or not as focused on the plights of immigrants. Contact them and ask them to contact their legislators. So that's certainly the case for the whole country, given the divisive nature that immigration and immigration reform still holds. I know that the congresswoman that is both of our congresswoman, Lori Trahan, is a very strong supporter. So appreciate her support for the legislation, and so appreciate you telling your story, and just wondering if you have any uh, final recommendations, or what other activism you're up to right now to all the listeners?
Well, I really would love, well, first of all, thank you so much for giving me the platform to share my story. I think, it's fantastic. But another thing I would say, because this is, you are a state senator and this is kind of like Massachusetts centric, it's that, understand that, I would love to talk a little bit about question 4 because it's, related to the immigrant community. And I would just
Yes,
say that local politics, really, we want give people the opportunity to drive. It makes safer roads and also lets people live with dignity. And so I want to say thank you for championing that cause. And that's
thank
something
you.
that I'm very interested in working towards, is getting people to vote yes on question 4 in November.
Absolutely, and really appreciate you saying that. So yes, a question for uh, anyone who hasn't been as focused on the referenda this fall is that when we as voters go to vote on Tuesday, November 8th in the general elections, there's 4 ballot questions, and question 4 is a yes/no question, and yes on 4 would be to say that you approve of the driver's license law for undocumented immigrants, to make sure that everyone is licensed and insured on the road to improve public safety. The legislature passed this. I was very proud to vote for it. And Vindra, thanks so much for raising that up and sort of showing that immigrants of all different statuses, we all have a common, and all residents have a common experience, common goals, and just want to make sure everyone is safe and secure. So thanks for mentioning that, and that's yes on 4. I look forward to advocating for that as well. So thank you so much, and Vrinda Punj, the state liaison for improve the dream. Thanks so much for having me on Uplifting Voices. Thanks for all those who following us today, and we'll be back to a monthly schedule. So please stay tuned for the next event, and hope you enjoyed this podcast. Take care.